Today is Saturday, May 20th, 2017. And I'm your host, Tyler Nixon, and we are breathlessly awaiting the arrival of the Master of Ceremonies, the man after whom the Stone Cold Truth is named, Roger Stone. And what I'm saying is what the name of the documentary that just came out is Get Me Roger Stone. So whoever is listening out there, get me Roger Stone, because we need him on the show this week. He's got a little slight delay. Roger's got a very busy schedule, as I'm sure anyone who follows him would know. He's been doing a lot of work on InfoWars with Alex Jones. Really good stuff if you haven't caught that yet, by the way. It's available on YouTube, and there's clips all over. It's really fast-paced, hard-hitting material that has reveals a lot of deep state kind of stuff. It's the kind of commentary you would never get even on the more alternative news outlets. They really take on the hardcore issues that the real issues that are affecting us all, I think, ultimately, which is not so much the typical politics and partisan issues as it is the intelligence community, the controllers, the fixers, the Beltway crowd, the manipulators, the climbers, the parasites, all of them who are looking to effectively undermine our republic, to destroy the Constitution, and to undermine our liberties, our freedoms, our privacy, and all in the name of an intelligence, military, and security superstate. And Donald Trump is absolutely at the tip of their spear, or they would like him at the tip of their spear. And this week has been one of the most ridiculous frenzies that I've ever witnessed in my life. And I've been following politics for over 30 years, easily. It's, I guess, to be 33 years. I've been closely following it since I was a kid, starting out with the Reagan campaign in 1984. And this has just been... It's very frustrating, actually, because the Democrats, and the Clintons in particular, are particularly adept at we're having a technical issue here, folks, are particularly adept at this type of manipulation, this type of lying, of creating their talking points nonsense, really, getting all on the same page with the big lie, and then just spreading it through, spreading it throughout the cultural consciousness. The Clintons, I think, began this in the late 1990s. They are the masters of manipulation and of putting out a talking points lie, effectively, that they are able to get all their flacks to go out and repeat. And we've seen this now with particularly people like Adam Schiff and this Swalwell guy, and the completely execrable, detestable, repugnant Maxine Waters. This woman is a complete whack job. There's just no two ways about it. She is a nutcase. She accused this week Vladimir Putin of coming up with and the Russians with coming up with the phrase "lock her up." I mean, this woman is not even in the same galaxy, much less on another planet. And this is the best the Democrats can do. This is the type of leadership that they're offering in alternative to President Trump, who has put forth a substantive agenda, has been trying to get some things done here, trying to mend international fences. Thank God he's got a little bit of a break from the domestic craziness, although, of course, they'll be yapping and nipping at his heels. Nonetheless, he can travel the world, and then they'll scour the earth, I'm sure, to push their nonsense, to push the big lie. And it's really becoming increasingly embattled, I think. You see folks who would normally hold a firm line, even the firmest of supporters, tending to begin to crack a little bit. I think they're getting worried, and it really requires a strong constitution, literally and figuratively, folks, because this is not going to be easy. It's never going to be a simple fight, a few rounds by which the Democrat partisan megalomaniac authoritarian scum are going to give up their power. They have been amassing this for close to a century. Donald Trump is just the intro shot, the opening salvo, so to speak, to dismantle the administrative superstate, to decentralize power out of Washington, D.C., to lower the burden on working families and, frankly, everyone else while we're at it, from this parasitic, multi-trillion-dollar, gigantic, ravenous government that operates from a distance, that would pass its edicts from on high, that would attempt to control the American people, and to effectively really just gut every notion of a democratic system that operates as a republic that we all cherish. And it really is grotesque. It exposes them for what they are. They want to talk about what they want to do for the country, and they're all for working families and blah blah blah. When you see what they've done the last several months in terms of distracting and diverting the attention of the American people away from issues that matter to families, what you would call, I guess, the dinner table issues, taxes, war, peace. We're dealing with North Korea heating up, and all these issues, and all they can be concerned about is chasing their. Expletives are ready to fly here, folks, but chasing this fairy tale they've created that comes out of the sick, demented mind of that scum John Podesta and Robbie Mook and all these other fever-brained megalomaniacs. That's all they are. And it disgusts me to no end that these people are given so much as a second of airtime, and yet we have major networks and every major media outlet conspiring effectively to manufacture these BS stories to keep President Trump off balance, to keep him constantly on the defensive, to keep the Republicans beaten back, because they already softened them up, let's face it, over the entire year of 2016. Donald Trump was, nobody who figured they were an establishment Republican with any credibility would want to go near Trump, and then he actually won, so suddenly they're scrambling. But let's face it, there's no true allies within the GOP establishment or leadership for President Trump. I mean, you have Vice President Pence forming a PAC 6 months into the presidency. He's vice president. This is ridiculous. And again, I've said before, I'll say it again, that President Trump is someone who has the guts and has, I think, the fortitude to deal with this. I think he's uniquely the type of person who's been beaten up in the media before, well before he ever ran for president, so he's used to it. I think he really knows how to take the punches and how to just kind of weather the storm, but it really can be overwhelming. I mean, this is an onslaught unlike I've ever seen. And look, people say that the president maybe was being hyperbolic when he talked about being this witch hunt, and it's the worst the worst treatment of any politician in American history. Again, I think that may be a little bit exaggerated, but when you really think about it, if you look at this has been a few months into his presidency. I mean, Obama, they couldn't fall all over themselves enough saying, give the man a chance. And I remember waiting almost a year before I really substantively began to bore in on what the nonsense was that was going on. Not that I didn't push back, but I mean, I think we all attempted to give Obama a chance. And I think that that's been the case with just about every president that we've known except for Donald Trump. Well, except for George W. Bush to some extent. But even when George W. Bush was elected, or when it was declared, that he was going to be the winner, so to speak, there was no... it was sort of went back to normal, basically. With President Trump, it's been insane, totally insane. It's been just nonstop. And it's just been a carryover of the deceitful, despicable campaign that the Democrats, Hillary Clinton and their scum, waged against him. So, you're listening to Stone Cold Truth. We're going to have Roger here shortly. Jack Posobiec is coming on in the next two segments. It's going to be a great show, folks.
Hi, this is Bernie Sanders. And believe me, I know you may not believe me, but you gotta believe me. In my opinion, I like the Stone Cold Truth, and I listen to it.
Well, Senator Sanders, my socialist friend from Vermont, And friend of Roger Stone, too. Everybody's a friend of Roger Stone these days. Welcome back to the Stone Cold Truth. I'm your host, Tyler Nixon. We have Roger calling in here shortly. We've had some technical issues, but we're welcoming to the show Jack Posobiec. Jack, can you hear me? Anyone there?
Hey, Tyler, how you doing?
Hey, how's it going, Jack? Boy, it's been one of those. It's the NSA. I think they're pushing buttons somewhere, trying to keep us off the airwaves. But how's your Saturday going?
It's working overtime because people like Stone Cold Truth and people like Rebel Media, my own organization, we're just out there every single day. We don't quit. We don't take days off.
Yeah, exactly. It's we can't because as I sort of ranted and raved in the opening monologue, these guys, this has been just a nonstop onslaught against President Trump from the time he first announced, and they've only escalated it. And they don't care about the country whatsoever. They don't care about any substantive issues. It's all about their agenda, what they are wanting to do, which is to tie up this president, to stop any type of progress, to roll back this Leviathan super state, this quasi-socialist government that they've created in Washington, D.C., with its intelligence arms and its spying, mass surveillance, its and its arm of the mainstream media, effectively, that is just a propaganda arm for the leftist combine that exists in the Beltway. It's
exactly.
Grotesque. It's really grotesque.
What you're seeing here too is this is the same way that Donald Trump, he had to fight every single day on the campaign. There was some new scandal, there was some new thing coming out of left field that he would have to deal with, and it would be so hard to get his message across, to get his message out there, because they would keep pressuring him from all sides, from the left, from the right, from the media, because they know that the Donald Trump agenda is the most dangerous thing to the establishment, period, because if that thing actually starts to get put into place, and if jobs do start rolling back into this country, we already saw the economic boom that happened with the Trump presidency in terms of the markets. If this agenda goes through and this thing works out, nobody's going to want to vote for any of these establishment types anymore, because the jig will be up.
As Roger Stone had said in the great documentary that came out, if you didn't hate me, it would mean effectively that I'm not effective. I'm not being effective if you don't hate me, and that's just it with Trump. The amount and the volume and just the constant stream of lies about the man. I mean, it just amazes me that they're able to come out with it, and it's like one after another. It's like you can't unpack the last load of BS before they've got another one piled on top of it. What do you see now, this was particularly intriguing to me when you were on last week. And by the way, thank you for coming on, Jack. I really appreciate it. You were a very compelling guest, and you're particularly in the eye of the storm there in the White House press corps. Do these people just sit around and like some sort of sewing circle come up with this nonsense? I mean, it's so incredible when you see what comes out, and they just, I mean, literally an unsourced New York Times article or Washington Post article, and suddenly it's like a rash all over everything but a couple of outlets, Fox being one, and even Fox has to cover it because it's in the air, it's the narrative. What do you see from the White House press corps side? And I think we have Roger with us. Actually, I'm sorry to interrupt.
Oh, great.
We'll let you. Roger, do you?
On this end, we seem to have trouble getting a decent phone line.
Well, welcome to your show, Roger. It's great to have you with us. We've
great to be here. I hear great things about this show.
Yes. Well, Jack was just about to give us a little insight into the Washington press corps. The White House press corps.
Yeah. So Roger, as you know, a lot of these people we see on the television screen, the people on camera, they're fed a script. They're actors in many ways. They are fed a script. They're given things over their earpieces. There's many people that are sitting there that are working on scripts. They're on Slack channels. They're doing collusion in real time with each other to coordinate their narrative so that they don't ever ask anything off that. I'll be sitting in the room and everyone's screaming about Russia, 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 Russia from multiple outlets, and then all of a sudden I might throw in a question about, hey, what about the leaks? Hey, what about Seth Rich? Hey, what about this Saudi arms deal, Saudi nuclear talks? And I get all these looks from the people because they have no idea what I'm even talking about.
Well, Roger, did you have a comment?
Yeah, no, look, I think that's exactly right. This is I have a certain sense of deja vu. What is happening in the country now is precisely what happened in 1974. They could not defeat Richard Nixon at the ballot box despite their best try. We now know that Nixon was taken down in a deep state coup. Consider the following. The Watergate burglary team was infiltrated by the Central Intelligence Agency. At least 3 members of the burglar team were still active employees of the Central Intelligence Agency and were reporting every move to their case officers. Secondarily, Judge John Sirica was meeting ex parte with both Leon Jaworski and with his predecessor, Archibald Cox, for which they all could have been disbarred. And most certainly, Sirica would have been impeached, and the Watergate burglars trial would have been thrown out had we known at the time. Thirdly, we know that the Pentagon had an exhaustive spying operation going on inside the White House, that a yeoman named Radford was systematically copying foreign policy documents from the desk and briefcase of Henry Kissinger, among others, and sending them to the Pentagon for the Joint Chiefs' perusal. Nixon's sin, very similar to Trump. He was for peace. You see, the military-industrial complex is not for peace. They're for war. War is profitable. War is fun for them. And Nixon's transgressions were, quite simply, ending the war in Vietnam on a much faster timetable than the Pentagon wanted, reaching nuclear arms warhead limitations with the Soviets, and then lastly, of course, opening the door to China over the objections of his own national security apparatus. So you have, I think, a very analogous situation. Trump does not favor war, he favors peace. And that's why you have these manufactured stories. For example, the president divulged classified information to the Russians. Really? He told the Russians he was concerned that ISIS was developing technology to turn PCs into bombs that could be smuggled onto an airplane. The fact that that information had appeared in over 100 newspapers made it not exactly a big state secret. Then we have the nut job, James Comey. And by the way, he is most definitely a nut job. Why he has not been prosecuted for his role in the cover-up of money laundering at HSBC, where he personally took payoffs, in essence, for covering up and minimizing that crime, and then later goes to work for them as a board member, reaping millions, I cannot understand. If Jeff Sessions is awake, convene the grand jury on that one immediately. But that's not happening. Now you have this idea that Comey says he has a memo.
Right.
This is Bill Clinton, and you're about to enter the world of the Stone Cold Truth.
Roger Stone. We're back with my co-host, Tyler Nixon, who did the honors of opening the show, and our friend from Rebel Media, Jack Posobiec, crusading boy journalist, better known in the movement as Jumpin' Jack Flash. And we're talking about the deep state coup that is afoot in the mainstream media attempt to remove Donald Trump by force because they could not defeat him at the ballot box. And on the break, we were discussing the news yesterday that the FBI has identified a White House advisor as a person of interest in the Russia probe. And we took a little vote off air, and we voted 0-3 that Jared Kushner is the likely suspect. Now, I have said all along that I know of no contact between the Russian state and anyone associated with Donald Trump. I can speak, obviously, for myself. I have a 50-year association with Paul Manafort, who assures me that he had no contacts whatsoever with the Russian state, and I believe him. It appears to me like General Flynn's contacts were largely benign. I don't think they constitute collusion. Of course, there is one person I can't speak for, and that is Jared Kushner. I don't know what Mr. Kushner may have done, but I do know that he has given his father-in-law extraordinarily bad advice when it comes to staffing this White House. I believe the president is very, very unhappy with the fact that no one on his staff seems to step up and defend him. There is no proactive communication strategy to counter these efforts by the New York Times in the case of the fake Comey memo that most likely does not exist, or the Washington Post claim that the president divulged classified information that was already known to the entire world, which, of course, would be entirely consistent with his authority to do so. So when you have a White House that consists of Reince Priebus and Sean Spicer and Dina Habib Powell, Islamist Bushy, what do you expect? Stone's rules. When you go to bed with dogs, you wake up with fleas. Jack, what's your take?
Well, it's interesting, Roger. Now the fact that I have a position, my point of view is actually inside the White House. So I've been around these people all the last 2 weeks, around Kushner, around Dina Habib Powell. I get to be right up and close with them. I was actually standing right in the room with them this week when Turkish President Erdogan came in, not 2 feet from Dina Habib Powell. Her and Jared Kushner have been extremely working close together. I know for a fact that they worked together on a lot of these deals sort of behind the scenes with the Saudis that we're now seeing signed today in the press. Today, Donald Trump over there. They're also working on specific plans for working with the Saudis to combat radicalism and setting up new centers over there. But what it really comes down to is sending hundreds of millions of dollars from the U.S. to the Saudis. Jared Kushner today, right after the arms deal was signed with the Saudis, $110 billion, was seen high-fiving H.R. McMaster in the room. This was reported by Politico on the scene. This was reported widely. No pictures as far as I'm told, but it's very interesting to see the business connections of Jared Kushner, who, of course, is tied to Roman Abramovich, who is one of Putin's advisors. So that is one of the biggest businessmen in Russia. Yep. And if I had to put money on it, I would suspect that is the connection that the FBI may have named him for.
Yeah, not repealing Obamacare, not tax reform, not any of the agenda that the president ran on. They're high-fiving an arms deal with the Saudis. That says it all. Well,
and watching this on television, in all honesty, I want to vomit. Let's be very, very clear. The Saudis financed the attack on America on 9/11. They are fighting efforts in the Congress to pay the families whose members were killed, murdered in that attack. They finance Wahhabism. They finance terrorism. They are pro-terrorist. They sponsor terrorism. And any money you give them will be used to bolster the terrorists. Now, candidate Trump seemed to know this, but President Trump doesn't seem to. If the Trump administration becomes a carbon copy of the Bush administration, he will not survive 4 years. His base will turn on him, and they will stand by and watch while the mainstream media drives him from office, despite the fact that he now seems to be, at least on the international stage, hewing to their agenda. This is extraordinarily disappointing. I did not spend 30 years trying to elect Donald Trump president so he could hire a traitor like Dina Habib Powell. Next week on InfoWars, we will be launching a petition to the president demanding she be fired. It reads as follows. Mr. President, I will not vote for your reelection nor work for it if Dina Habib Powell continues to be employed in your administration. We seek 1 million signatures. Let's see what happens. It'll be most interesting.
We're going to hold Jack over.
The only chance of survival, to me, is a house cleaning, top to bottom.
Absolutely.
Spicer, Priebus, Powell, Gary Cohn. Why would you
Roger, we're got a station break coming up here. We're going to hold Jack over to the next segment, and I'm going to ask him about when we come back from the break. I'm going to ask him about how much he has to bite his tongue with the mainstream media working amongst them, because he is a journalist, but also he is certainly has a point of view. So you're listening to the Stone Cold Truth here on Genesis Communications Network. I'm sorry. Okay. Well, folks, that was premature. I'm looking at the clock here. Well, anyway, so once again, we're listening to Stone Cold Truth. We've got Roger Stone and Jack Posobiec, and we're discussing the deep state, and we're discussing the quizzlings that surround the president. The most, in my opinion, and I do not say this lightly, the most ill-served president in modern times. You're listening again to the Stone Cold Truth here on the Genesis Communications Network. Don't go away.
I'll bring us in.
Hi, this is former President Jimmy Carter. Rosalind and I like the Stone Cold Truth because, like me, Roger Stone always tells the truth.
Welcome back. I'm Roger Stone, and you're at the right place at the Stone Cold Truth here on the Genesis Communications Network. Joining me are my stalwart co-host, Tyler Nixon, great-grandson of our greatest American president, and Jack Posobiec of Rebel Media, known in conservative circles as Jumpin' Jack Flash. And we're talking about the turmoil in the Trump White House and the deep state efforts to take down our president through a series of manufactured scandals that are sparked by fake news. Tyler, take it away.
I wanted to ask Jack, actually, how he disguises his contempt. Clearly, you have your leanings, Jack, and you're coming from a certain ideological direction. You have to work amongst these people all day long, and you watch, I'm sure, in a unique view, the unfolding of these fake stories. They drop it in the New York Times, the Washington Post. It gets picked up by the cable networks. Then they start the feeding frenzy, and then following it up for whatever the day is. You have the Rachel Madcows and such who, gravely opine about, the latest BS to be troweled out of the bag of tricks. Do you have to maintain a certain? I'm sure you have maintained decorum, but how do you deal with that all day long?
There's times where we're using like the shared kitchen, we're using a shared bathroom at the same time. I'll be in there, and Jim Acosta or Pete Rogers will be in there. And so it's interesting to say the least. But what? And it's it's sort of like, hey, you're doing your job, I'm doing my job, and we sort of keep we know who we are, we know who's on what side. But what's interesting to me, and the times where I just have to laugh sometimes, is you'll get these questions to either Sean Spicer or H.R. McMaster, particularly from people like NBC News or CNN, where it's almost as if they're speaking with knowledge of some alternate universe. When they were talking, they were asking questions about that Russian meeting. They were asking the questions of, well, why did President Trump decide to share classified information right as the meeting started? Was that his first, idea? And they said, and I just kind of turned to Tanya Tay, my lovely producer, and we sort of had this look of like, how do you know that? How could you ask such a purposely misleading gotcha question in a forum like this, like the White House?
Very interesting yesterday to see a piece by Nick Kristof, one of the worst writers at the New York Times, in which he essentially fingers the leakers when he starts praising, as he puts it, the adults, McMaster, Jim Mattis, I guess they're on intimate terms, and Dina Habib Powell, the most egregious leaker in the Trump White House. He's really fingering the bad guys for us, those who must be discharged if Trump is to survive. I've never seen an administration leak like this. Now, Jim Baker, who was President Reagan's chief of staff, was an adept leaker, I assure you, but he leaked for some good purpose. He leaked in the interests of the president. That's a strategic game that I completely understand. In this case, the leaks almost monolithically harm the administration, and they're insulting, if not detrimental, to the president.
I'm curious, Jack, because again, you have an intelligence background. Just the other day, they said they released this supposed quote from President Trump calling Comey a nut job to the Russians. How the hell would they know verbatim anything the president said in the inner sanctum of the presidency? I mean, do you think that they're bugging him, or do you think there are people in the room that are leaking? I mean, it just seems so brazen.
So it's one of the two, essentially. All conversations and meetings within the White House under most presidents, to include Bush, to include Obama, all the way back, and of course Richard Nixon, are generally recorded. Bill Clinton, of course, did not do much reporting in the Oval Office for obvious reasons. So it could be that they are tapping into a source of these recordings. That's one way, and they would certainly have the technical means to do so through the Joint Task Force POTUS, which controls the IT systems for the White House. But another and quite more direct option is the one that Roger just presented, that Dina Powell, one of the people in the meeting, is simply turning around to her good friend Maggie Haberman at the New York Times and telling her what was said.
God, it's so diabolical. It amazes me. I don't want to let this segment go and let the hour go without bringing up Seth Rich. And I don't know if you have any insight into that, Jack, or if you followed the story, but this is a major story here. If this was a Republican that was someone who worked for the RNC, was found shot to death on the streets of D.C. in a supposed robbery, but nothing was taken from him, and then an investigator comes out and says, yeah, he was leaking to WikiLeaks, you would never hear the end of it. And yet this poor man
is actually kind of interesting. So, since I'm the White House correspondent with Rebel, and with Trump out of town for all next week, I'm kind of wondering if I should, is there a reason for me to keep going to the White House? We've done some discussions, and what I think I'm going to do for a few days while Trump is out of town is actually go and do an investigation of the Seth Rich murder episode. Go and talk to the business owners that had security cameras along his route. I've been in contact with Kim.com, who has done a lot of research into this, who has a lot of sources on the ground. Go and talk to the bar owner of Lou's Bar, a man by the name of Joe Capote, who was actually seen in the Barack Obama White House just days before. We were able to place him via social media and the White House guest register. He was in the White House days before the murder of Seth Rich. Very interesting there. And then to be the owner of the bar where Seth Rich had his final drink. So I'm going to be doing a couple of days of actually just shoe leather, flat foot reporting and investigation from the ground to see if I can shake a few things loose and actually find some evidence, get to the bottom of what happened that night.
Well, you're doing God's work, because frankly the body count behind the Clintons is just staggering, and this poor man, I have no doubt in my mind, was assassinated. It was no random robbery. I lived in Washington D.C. long enough to know you don't just get shot at 4 a.m. for no damn good reason, especially not a white kid in it might be a sketchy area, but this is just too coincidental. At least to my eye. Where are the
security camera footage? You every single corner of Washington D.C. has cameras on it, everywhere. Businesses that have cameras. There's the police have closed circuit cameras everywhere. Where is this footage? If this footage has not been made, is it with the police? The police now mentioned they had body cams, the responding officers who arrived while Seth Rich was alive, according to the incident reports. Where is the footage on those body cameras? Oh, you know what? The Metropolitan Police Department of D.C. says they lost the body cam footage.
Yeah,
how convenient. How convenient. Now, you have a number of interesting factors here. First of all, there's the change in the story of Seth Rich's parents. Initially, they themselves denied that this was a robbery. Now suddenly they're being represented by a crisis communications consultant paid for by the Democratic National Committee. To say the least, that is suspicious. You have the private detective who has come forward and said that his sources in the D.C. Metropolitan Police tell him that the laptop, which was utilized by Mr. Rich, shows multiple contacts with WikiLeaks. You have Fox now reporting that over 40,000 documents were sent from Rich to WikiLeaks. When I raised this with Michael Isikoff in an interview on Yahoo.com, Yahoo News, he acted as if I were a conspiracy theorist. Actually, I would say anyone who doesn't suspect a political assassination, a murder with political motive, is painfully naive. The question is really why the president has not ordered the FBI to take over the investigation from the D.C. Metropolitan Police. The truth is the president controls both entities, although he controls the D.C. Metropolitan Police indirectly, perhaps. And it's time for a real investigation. There's no doubt in my mind, if you look at it, the British diplomat, Craig Murray. Craig Murray has said that Rich was his contact and that Rich passed off documents to him in a floppy disk form that were handed off in a parking lot near American University. There's no question in my mind that this guy was executed because he was blowing the whistle on Hillary Clinton and Deborah Wasserman Schultz and their efforts to steal the nomination from Bernie.
Yep. Well, I want to thank Jack Posobiec for coming on the show. Jack, the time went too fast. We hope to have you back again soon. You're listening to Stone Cold Truth here on the Genesis Communication Network. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Stone Cold Truth here on the Genesis Communications Network. I am the co-host for Roger Stone, Tyler Nixon. And Roger, of course, is joining us from an undisclosed remote location. And joining us for the next 3 segments, an historian, really a treasure as far as the true history of our country goes, Len Kolodny, writer of Silent Coup, 40 Years War, and Nixon's Gamble. Some great books. Len, welcome to the Stone Cold Truth.
Tyler, it's good to be here with you and Roger. And I think we'll get a new way of attacking this, what we call Watergate.
Right.
And that's a misnomer. It covers almost anything you want to say it covers, but it's truly got its place in the history of this story. When Nixon was inaugurated on January 20th, 1969, he went back to the White House and he fired the first shot in what I would call Nixon's wars. He signed a document called NSDM-2, which took all the power away from the State Department, Defense Department, and the CIA and placed it within the National Security Council. The document also, for some reason or other, left off the director of the CIA as a member of the council, and that made Mr. Helms very, very upset. And who was director of the CIA at the time. This was a remarkable move by the president. It basically put all the powers, the war powers, and everything in his hands and his call him his puppet, Henry Kissinger. And he had a plan. He had a secret plan that he would run out of a secret government. And what did he want to accomplish? He wanted to cut a deal with the Soviet Union on arms. He wanted an opening to China, and he wanted to control the war in Vietnam himself. And this started to immediately rankle the people who lost power under this plan and knowledge under this plan. He took certain steps that had they known about it, they would have just absolutely exploded. He sent Henry Kissinger to meet with Ambassador Dobrynin just 30 days after being in office, and told Dobrynin, we're not going to win the war in Vietnam, so don't worry. Don't get too panicky. And so he and Kissinger start on their projects, and as they do, resistance builds up because knowledge is being cut off. The military begins to form a spy ring headed by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs in 1969. And another event happens in 1969, which really seems like nothing then, but we might feel differently about it today. That is, a young Navy lieutenant went to work in the Nixon White House within the secret government, and he manned a secret back channel around the State Department and Defense Department, and he would take the messages, these highly classified messages, to the White House and deliver them to then Colonel Haig. That young man's name is Robert Upshur Woodward. So we have the first entry of Bob Woodward, seemingly a nothing, but by the fall of '69, he was in place. There were other actions that got them in the war, the wiretaps of reporters and staff members. So it was a full-fledged war. All the while, Nixon is secretly moving to cut deals, in many cases using Vietnam as a bargaining chip. And it goes on until December of '71, when they catch the spy ring people. They're at the highest level. They go up to Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Moore. And inside the White House, they have their own spy named Alexander Haig, who is busy telling them what to steal and to learn from the White House. So now the war is full-fledged, but the opponents, and this is the interesting part, it's the military, it's the intelligence community, it is the media.
And defense contractors, of course.
Well, there is a real... that Nixon is going to pull this off. He's going to pull the trifecta off. He's going to get us out of Vietnam in 4 years. Of course, some of us think that was way too long. And he had an opening to China, and then he cut a secret deal which the Senate had to choke on to pass. And that kind of takes us up to the election and the events that would follow that. This is what I call Nixon's war. We get to this point, and there's a break-in at the DNC, and we call that Watergate. And that is just a battle in this war. It is a battle in this war that will be used by Nixon's enemies in the intelligence community, in the media, in the military, to eventually force him out of office and regain their power.
I would have to say, Len, if I may, that Ray Locker's book, Nixon's Gamble, is an absolutely crucial source on this entire area. Really, an outstanding book, which I commend to our listeners. And of course, Nixon's sin was very similar to Trump's. He was for peace. He was doing these things for peace, limiting nuclear warheads with the Soviets, getting a dialogue finally with China, ending the Vietnam War. I know at the time you thought it was too slow. The Pentagon thought it was much too fast.
I would also point out real quick that, Roger, just sorry to interrupt, that Len is not a Republican partisan or a Nixon partisan. You're a liberal Democrat, right, Len?
Last time I checked.
Okay.
But
sorry, Roger.
Unfortunately,
Proceed.
couldn't vote that way this time.
Well, I think that the situation is extraordinarily analogous in the sense that the same foes of Richard Nixon are now the foes of Donald Trump. He is, I think, being subjected to the same kind of deep state coup. The idea that his conversation with the Russians, in which he said that he was concerned that ISIS was developing laptops that could be used as bombs on airplanes, that was a deep, dark secret. It's appeared in over 100 American newspapers in the last 6 months. But we made that a faux scandal. That became a faux scandal. Now we have the so-called Comey memo, which no one has seen. We don't even know if it really exists. In fact, the fact that the New York Times says it exists is, to me, overwhelming evidence that it probably doesn't exist.
And even if it did exist, it's not as though Comey couldn't have sat down the day after he was fired and written it. There's no way to verify that when it was written.
So it's your classic Washington bureaucratic revenge play.
Well, my
when
point,
the
Roger,
president told the Russians that Comey was a nut job, if he really said that, he'd be understating the case, frankly.
Well, the reason I laid this out this way is because Nixon learned something from Kennedy. Kennedy was out making speeches in '63 about wanting to make a deal with the Soviet Union and so forth. Did it publicly. Nixon understood the only way this was going to happen is secretly. Donald Trump is far more open than Richard Nixon and his secret government. And so we're seeing a more open war. This is an extension of the same war. The same forces working in this presidency of Donald Trump are the same forces.
Len, let me get you to hold that thought. We're gonna get to our commercial break here. We're listening to the Stone Cold Truth, Roger Stone and Tyler Nixon. We are our guest Len Kolodny. Don't go away.
Hi, this is Bernie Sanders. And believe me, I know you may not believe me, but you gotta believe me. In my opinion, I like the Stone Cold Truth, and I listen to it.
Welcome back. I'm Roger Stone. You're here broadcasting from the Stone Zone here at the Stone Cold Truth on the Genesis Communications Network, and I'm joined by the author of Silent Coup and 40 Years War, Len Kolodny, who is an expert on the deep state and their machinations through the 70s, 80s, and beyond, and also by the Nixon family member, Tyler Nixon, who is my stalwart co-host. And we're talking about the parallels between what went down and what we now broadly call Watergate, although, as Len points out, Watergate's really more of a battle in a larger war, in the current efforts to undermine President Donald Trump for the same reasons. Trump is a peacemaker. He prefers détente with the Russians as opposed to war over Syria, and he is paying a heavy price for it. Len, why don't you pick up where you left off?
So we're now up to the election, and this event happens that the president knows nothing about, didn't order it, and somehow it seems to be in the middle of it. And it's kept alive by a young reporting team then called Bernstein and Woodward, Carl Bernstein being his partner. And they were the only people writing about it. Nobody else paid attention to it. And then finally, Walter Cronkite, who was the anchor of his day on CBS, he got a hold of the story and ran 20 minutes on it, and it became an issue. But it wasn't an issue that hurt too badly because Richard Nixon won that election by over 10 million votes. So we go into the next year, and it's still bubbling. It's still bubbling, and Nixon is still functioning at top level. But it wears away at Nixon. And I suspect it's wearing away somewhat on Trump, because the level of attacks in the media got to be more and more. And then the big news was that the Senate was going to form a Watergate committee to investigate this. Sound familiar? Yep, that's where the aces begin to get a lot stronger. And around that, it's wearing on the president. John Dean, the author of the break-in, is busy telling the president that there's no White House involvement. Don't worry. But somehow or another, it keeps getting closer and closer. And John Dean is fearful of being called to testify on the Hill before the Senate Armed Services Committee. And he finally goes to the president on March 13th, 1973, and says, oh, by the way, Gordon Strawn, an aide to Bob Haldeman, who was Nixon's chief of staff, he knew about the break-in. And for the next 5 days, March 13th to 20th, the two men connive to cover up Watergate and cover up Strawn. What the president didn't know is the reason Dean told him was because he wanted the president to invoke executive privilege if, in fact, he were called before the Armed Services Committee. So times are getting tougher as we get into March and April, and finally Nixon is worn down by revelations that his top people, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Mitchell being his attorney general, but had left the Justice Department, H.R. Haldeman, his chief of staff, and his domestic chief, John Ehrlichman. And it got so bad that Nixon had to fire them, but he called it a resignation. And at the same time, after Dean had finally reported that there's a cancer on the presidency, but never told the president he was the cancer, he had been fully picked up by Nixon's enemies. The intelligence community, the armed services, and the media were going full strength, and this was a depressed president. And the interesting thing is he wanted to appoint John Connally to be his next chief of staff. And this is sort of a side story, but it's at the heart of this thing. He doesn't do it. He doesn't do it because Bob Haldeman talks him out of John Connally. Connally had been governor of Texas and shot with JFK on that day in Dallas, and had become a real Nixon guy. Nixon loved tough guys. Like Mitchell was a tough guy. Connally was a tough guy. But Haldeman
you might say that Connally was everything Nixon wanted to be: self-assured,
absolutely,
confident. I frankly, and Connally was a trophy for Nixon. He had been shot with JFK.
Yes.
And therefore he became a major trophy for the Nixon White House. He would ultimately become Treasury Secretary.
But here's the kicker. Colson and Haig got together, and Colson and Haldeman got together, and they convinced the president not to do Connally, but to do Haig. And this was the great mistake. This is that if ever someone gave the enemy the sword, this was it. Remember that spy ring that was caught, where Haig was in the spy ring as the chief guy inside the White House, feeding the military spy ring. Nixon had stopped that investigation short of the revelation about Haig. He would say things like, well, Haig had to know, but he never followed through on it. But Admiral Wellender, who was part of it, and by the way, Woodward's former boss on the USS Fox, he confessed to Haig's involvement, but it all got buried with a young man named David Young, who was an aide to Ehrlichman and to Kissinger. So here we are at the end of the day, and the Nixon White House is appointing as chief of staff and bringing the enemy into the most powerful position at a time when he was most depressed. And he says to Haig, you can have the domestic side, basically giving him the power of the presidency. And we mentioned Ray Locker before, and Ray Locker is currently working on a book called The Hague Presidency. And it will open up more and more doors for us to understand. I think this is the mirror that we are watching today. We are seeing a media out of control, publishing things they would never publish because, as Roger pointed out, the memo apparently was read to somebody over a phone. That nobody's seen this memo. And, by the way, it was memo back in February. So we're seeing all those forces coming together. What worries me is that there is somebody inside the White House who can't be trusted like Haig. Today I was very concerned by the leak that came out of the Oval Office on the Russians. It just began to smell too much like something is going on here. There are too many leakers and too many anonymous leakers, which tells me, from my experience, that we may have had an infiltration here.
Well, you're listening to Stone Cold Truth with Roger Stone and our guest, Len Kolodny. Len is going to stay with us, and we're going to complete this. Don't go away.
This is Bill Clinton, and you're about to enter the world of the Stone Cold Truth.
The Stone Cold Truth here on the Genesis Communications Network. We're broadcasting from the Stone Zone and continuing with the author of Silent Coup, the definitive book on Watergate and the Watergate scandal, and the 40-Year War, which puts the Watergate scandal in a much broader perspective. I commend both of these books to you if you want to understand what's happening to President Donald Trump today. Past is prologue, and these books are required reading, to say the least. So, Nixon's Gamble by Ray Locker should be mentioned, and of course I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that my updated book, now entitled Tricky Dick, The Rise and Fall and Rise of Richard Milhouse Nixon, will be out June 12th in paperback. So I commend that to you. In case you haven't been paying attention, The Bush Crime Family, an updated paperback, is now in bookstores. You can find it at Barnes & Noble and Amazon, with an entirely new chapter on George P. Bush, the Texas Railroad Commissioner, and the next criminal from the House of Bush. So, Len, let's pick it up. Your narrative brings us right to the time that Nixon is under siege. John Dean, who claims that his book, Nixon's Defense, is the definitive book on Watergate, but who conveniently manages to leave out a number of the key dates and transcripts in which he coaches Nixon on perjury and how to commit perjury, and exposes the fact, just in case anybody wonders, John Dean is the man who comes up with the Watergate break-in, pushes it, covers it up, and then very successfully blames it on others. If you're listening, Mr. Dean, please sue me as soon as possible. I can't wait till for those interrogatories.
It ain't going to happen. But you have to realize that this is a turning point. And Dean is over here, and he's going to be used. But there's another person who Haig brings in with him, counsel from the Pentagon, J. Fred Bozark. He is representing both the Pentagon on the spy ring against his new client, Richard Nixon. A clear conflict, but these are two people who are locked together. Haig has committed a number of crimes, not just spying on the president, stealing from the president, but he's deeply involved in the wiretap operation with Bill Sullivan over at the FBI. And so he has many, many vulnerabilities himself, criminal vulnerabilities. And no sooner than he gets in, he wants to expose the taping system. And on May 16th, there's a headline on the Post that Walters says that Nixon is going to use the CIA to block the FBI. And the next morning, May 17th, Robert Upshur Woodward goes to the Watergate Committee and suggests they call Alexander Butterfield. Well, they were too filled up with people to call Alexander Butterfield, but Woodward wouldn't stop trying because now the team is set. It's Woodward, Buzzard, and Haig, with Haig the team leader. Woodward the outside guy. Comes July, he really needs that taping system released because he's got to get Nixon out of there before he gets caught in his crime. And he again sends Woodward up to the Hill to reveal Butterfield. And this time they get him, and this time he reveals it. And the whole thing turns away from Dean, thanks to Senator Baker, saying, what did the president know and when did he know it? And Alexander Haig now has to wait for those tapes to come forth to force Nixon's resignation. And Nixon thinks that Haig did him a favor. He thinks that Haig got him a pardon. The only thing he ever did was force the president out of office. And that can't happen again. No matter whether you're a Democrat, Republican, if you're an American, we have a process. Use the process. But that's not what we're seeing here. They are wanting Donald Trump to resign. That's why it's coming in waves now. You don't even have to know what the paper says, because you can guess that today's paper and the next day's paper will be revelations based on speculation, It's incredible. And in the media, who's going to be the next Woodward and Burns? I mean, they're already wanting to do a movie. So I think I've been able to show you the steps. The enemy beat Nixon, and they never went away. And Donald Trump got up and said Russia, and the world came to an end. Remember, when Nixon did Russia, it was the real Cold War. This is nonsense compared to when Nixon did it. But you would think it was the Cold War all over again. Frankly, I'm glad that he's doing it openly, so I know what he's doing. I believe that Russia is the key to getting us out of the Middle East. No matter what else is involved here with the Russians, they are the ones that can get us out of the mess that George W. Bush and friends put us in. And,
I find it interesting that you have four presidents in the last, say, half century who wanted to repair relations with the Soviets/Russians. You had John F. Kennedy, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and now Donald Trump. Kennedy got his brains blown out. Nixon was forced out of office in what we just went through, the whole quote Watergate scandal. Reagan was shot for 3 months into office, and then around the time that Gorbachev and he began to do this, you had Iran-Contra, you had this whole sort of scandalizing of his second term, and now of course President Trump. Boy, I tell you, it's a dangerous thing to try to have peace with the Soviets or with the Russians.
Notice that in the three books that I've had something to do with, the word Watergate's never in the title. Not once. There's a message there, folks. It's Nixon's wars, and it's now become Trump's wars. And he better do something about what's inside his White House, because there's some General Haigs lurking out there. And
well, also there's an interesting backstory here, because concurrent with all of this, of course, Vice President Agnew is removed for corruption.
Right.
The party leaders overwhelmingly favor the appointment of either Nelson Rockefeller or Barry Goldwater, but instead Nixon chooses Congressman Gerald Ford. As I detail in my book, Nixon's Secrets, Haig tells people Nixon took Ford because he had him by the testicles. And indeed, Haig brags that he gets a pardon agreement from Ford because he confronts Ford regarding his role in the Warren Commission, where there is indisputable proof now, documented in the biographies of both William Sullivan and Deke DeLoach, that Jerry Ford changes by hand the autopsy of John F. Kennedy taking the chart and moving the description of the wound in the middle of Kennedy's upper back to his lower neck. And Jerry Ford admits this in the New York Times almost 20 years later. And when asked why he did that, he said, well, the country needed closure. You notice he didn't say the country needed truth. So I'm convinced that Haig gets his pardon for Nixon out of court by threatening to expose him. Nixon lets it know that if he's going to trial, he's taking everybody down with him, and he knows many, many deep secrets of the deep state.
Well, I want to thank
I fear for President Trump because he, like Nixon, has surrounded himself with quislings. Let's name them.
Well, Roger, we only have about 30 seconds left here, so I just wanted to wrap
I'm going to thank Len. I'm going to thank you, Tyler, and I'm going to thank our listeners for tuning in to the Stone Cold Truth. We'll be back next week.
Well, we actually have one more segment, but we'll be back with Travis Irvine. Stay with us.
Hi, this is former President Jimmy Carter. Rosalind and I like the Stone Cold Truth because, like me, Roger Stone always tells the truth.
You're in the right place. This is the Stone Cold Truth. We're broadcasting from the Stone Zone. If you haven't had the opportunity to see the Netflix documentary, Get Me, Roger Stone, well, then there's something wrong with you. This could be the greatest single political documentary in American history. And I say that with great modesty. It is a must-see. There one sour note yesterday, a review by Mona Sharon, the ever-talentless Mona Sharon, who compared me, yeah, it's hard to believe, compared me to Anthony Weiner. Well, comparing me to Anthony Weiner would be like comparing Mona Sharon to Lady Gaga. I mean, I'm not sure where the comparison lies. I never was into underage girls. All the women I liked were adults over the age of 21. And I am, unlike Mr. Weiner, I am happily married. So I'm not sure what she was driving at, but she writes for the failing National Review.
Yeah.
If Bill Buckley were alive, he'd be rolling in his grave. He was a good friend of mine, and he would be unhappy with what's happened to his publication. In any event, we are joined by our favorite raconteur, filmmaker, stand-up comedian, libertarian activist, and all-around wise guy, Travis Irvine. Travis, welcome to the Stone Cold Truth.
Roger, Tyler, good to be with you guys as always. I loved the documentary. I thought it was well put together. I think it's a fascinating look into a fascinating person. I always have to explain to people, you know, I have a lot of liberal friends, and they're like, well, how can you possibly be friends with Roger Stone? How can you possibly hang out with a guy like that? And it's like, how can I not? He's so really fun. You got so many great stories. You've been such a mentor, such a friend. You know, you learn the ropes by studying with a guy like Roger Stone. I think my only complaint about the documentary was, you know, towards the end they're driving towards the 2016, you know, your support of Trump. But they left out, I think, you know, even with 15 seconds, they could have covered your libertarian phase there in 2012. That's where I met you, was working on the Gary Johnson campaign. You know, they kind of went through your greatest hits there from 2000 to 2016, talked about Al Sharpton, talked about taking down Spitzer. But I would have loved just, you know, 15 seconds about when you very publicly left the Republican Party, went to the Libertarians for a little bit, and you know, you still very much have a libertarian streak. I think they mentioned that, but I wish they focused on it a little bit more.
Well, also, you raise a good point. The defeat of Mitt Romney was essential, absolutely crucial. Governor Gary Johnson, very good guy, very good governor of New Mexico. I must say I was disappointed with his more recent presidential campaign. I think he's a more serious candidate than that. and frankly, we had a very good time. It was most enjoyable. You never, in politics, I think, suffer when you do the right thing, when you do the thing you believe in. And of the candidates for president 4 years ago, there's no doubt that he was the best. And he would have been a much better president than either Mitt Romney or Barack Obama. And I will never apologize for my support for Gary Johnson in 2012. He is a good man and a good friend. I agree with you. I wish they had touched on it. Overall, though, I would have to say the only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about.
Indeed.
And there's kind of a sour piece in today's Miami New Times by some guy named Iannelli, who you'll never hear from again because he's writing as badly as he possibly can. It amazes me the rancor, the hatred of the libtards. I see it on Twitter every day. Twisted freaks like David Brock, a man who should be in jail based on his tax evasion and his mixing of hard money, soft money, nonprofit money with hard money. If he were a Republican, he'd already be in the slammer. But it was fun to make. It was fun to watch. And I saw it in a theater in New York 2 weeks ago. And I must say, it blew my mind, really blew my mind.
Well, I'm going to jump in here because, first of all, that one thing that they didn't mention in the documentary, and it also a nattering nabob like Mona Sharon glosses over. Roger, you're a New York Times best-selling author. You've written multiple books on major historic events in the country, which I think are excellent, personally. And, I'm your friend, but also I would not associate with you if I didn't think that you were a man of honor and that you're transparent, you're honest about yourself, unlike anybody else that I've seen on the landscape who does what you do. And this is a great documentary. Go check it out. Roger's a good guy, and, I just knew immediately when there were these accusations of Russian collusion, all this, it was complete poppycock, because I've known you long enough and know your integrity. And despite being a hard-hitting, bare-knuckled political operator, you have a conscience and you have morals and you have integrity. And that's really what matters to me. I would not associate with you otherwise, and I say that with all sincerity. But that being said, Travis, it's true. I think liberalism, as they say, is a mental disorder. It's very much become like a cult. It's really how it is. They all parrot the same sort of ideology, the same dogma, and they just are like all in bed with this and can never come off it. Like, that's the test. Like, if someone never ever can alter their position or rethink it or change, they're really, it's like a religious cult, frankly. And that's why I laugh that they scoff at Christians and evangelicals, because they're just as much zealots as anybody I've ever seen in a religious cult.
Oh, yeah. It's been a fascinating week, in my work with Mediaite, and I'm very much an independent thinker. But, you guys have already talked about it. When the first line this week that they came out with in the Post, that Trump had leaked information to the Russians, when that one didn't pick up, you saw it the very next day with the Times piece saying that he asked Comey to stop the Flynn investigation. I'm watching CNN, and even as an independent thinker myself, I'm watching these CNN commentators. They are salivating. Jeffrey Toobin is drooling all over himself
horrible.
when he
Jeffrey
says.
Toobin, by the way, canned as a U.S. As an assistant U.S. attorney for unethical activity, is out pronouncing, who else is, passing judgments on others. I don't think he did me any harm in the documentary, but perhaps we ought to look at his background specifically. No, look, Gary Tapper must be mocked, belittled, and made fun of. The guy's a buffoon. He's a fool. He's a zero. And he's not a journalist, because journalists give you an opportunity to respond. When John Podesta attacked me on CNN, claiming that I knew about the hacking of his emails in advance, a lie for which there is no evidence whatsoever. When Ted Cruz, the faux conservative, the Bushy, who is responsible for everything that ever came out of George W. Bush's mouth, and then reinvented himself several years ago as a constitutional conservative, attacked me. Again, no call from CNN offering me a chance to respond. This is how they expose themselves. CNN is not a news organization. The people that work there need to be mocked and belittled and made fun of because they're not journalists. They're not even close. And you're right, Travis, they're salivating over doing what they could not do in the election, taking Donald Trump down.
Absolutely. And, you know, I always pull stories in from people on the left as well. I mean, and when we all agree, you know, Glenn Greenwald has pointed out that there's no meat to this Russia story. Noam Chomsky even pointed out this week, I sent the article to Tyler, that how is it that, you know, probably a good foreign policy move to have more stable relations with the Russians, how has that become Trump's biggest weakness? I mean,
he called the idea of collusion a joke, and this is Noam Chomsky. I mean, he's as left as you get. A joke is what he called.
Well, I mean, what this is really about is war. Hillary Clinton had promised the neocons the expansion of the proxy war in Syria. They were salivating over a no-fly zone. Wouldn't that be great? We could have World War III with the Russians. Peachy keen. And then, of course, she lost, and Trump won't give them their war. That's what this is really about. Trump is a peacemaker. He has no illusions about the Russian gulag or the corruption of their system, the fact that they oppress gays and Jews and Christians. He knows how rotten the Soviet system is, or the former Soviet system is. But that said, he'd like to try to negotiate peace before we move right over to thermonuclear war.
Indeed.
And for that, they're going to try to remove him.
Well, Travis, thanks for joining us. It's been great to have you with us.
Always good to be with you guys. Thank you so much.
Outstanding. And Roger, always great to be with you.
Tyler Nixon, let's just remember, Nixon's the one.
Amen to that. This has been the Stone Cold Truth. Have a great weekend.